Hello and welcome back to Advancing Healthcare Through Simulation. I'm your host, Lisa George. Today we're excited to welcome Dr. Tim Willett. He is the President and CEO of Simulation Canada, a national leader in advancing simulation-based education and training in healthcare. On the podcast today, we'll be discussing best practices that help create impactful, high-quality simulation-based training and how these principles are shaping workforce development and healthcare outcomes across Canada. Thanks so much for joining us. We'd like to dive right into our first question and ask you to give a bit of an overview of the current landscape of simulation-based education in healthcare across Canada.
That's a big question and a fantastic one to start with, Lisa. Simulation really has a strong footprint in Canada now. When I started in this role in sector 12 years ago, I wouldn't have said the same. It was still young and evolving, but now we see simulation as easily as an essential component of many healthcare education training programs across the country. Schools have adopted simulation not only as an enhancement to their education, but really as a core strategy to improve educational outcomes for their students. And we see more and more hospitals and other healthcare services adopting it as a core part of their quality improvement and patient safety strategies.
Yeah, and why do you think it's become so essential as a part of our training and retraining that we're seeing for healthcare education and continuing practice?
I think there's a couple reasons at play. One is that the evidence base for simulation is now very firmly established. There were a lot of years where there was skepticism about the additional resources required for simulation. And it is a more resource-intensive strategy than more traditional educational techniques, in that you need professionally trained people working in simulation, creating and facilitating the simulations. Sometimes you need equipment, sometimes you need actors. But what we've now seen is that the evidence base for the value of simulation for its incremental benefit above and beyond traditional training techniques is so well established that it justifies the investment in simulation. At the same time, we are in a context now of shortages of healthcare providers, incredible pressure on post-secondary institutions to maintain or increase their enrollment. Yet this is a double-edged sword, because at the same time, it's getting harder and harder to find high-quality clinical placements to teach students using the old paradigm of traditional learning in the classroom and then clinical learning via preceptorship in the workplace. So simulation has become really an essential technique for transitioning, expediting that transition from classroom-based learning to clinical learning. And we see many schools starting to rebalance the amount of time students spend in clinical simulation versus traditional clinical placement, and have the evidence now that doing so certainly doesn't compromise and may actually enhance educational outcomes for the students.
So you alluded to, simulation, requiring the right training, the right tools, that kind of thing. Can you tell us a little bit about what Simulation Canada is doing to drive the adoption and development of simulation best practices?
Sure. And there certainly are best practices. There's internationally recognized best practices that apply to any healthcare profession that have been published by under the leadership of INACSL, the International Nursing Association for simulation. And a major part of those best practices, as you mentioned, is professional development in simulation, where earlier in the days of simulation, it was largely up to interested educators to learn themselves what they could about simulation-based education and good practices and implement those to the best of their abilities. But now simulation and the practice of simulation has come to a point where that kind of casual approach to working in simulation is no longer broadly considered acceptable. There are good practices. There are skills and competencies to being a simulation educator that are different than typical education. So professional development in simulation has really become an essential part of overall quality assurance and quality improvement in simulation-based education. So that plays a major part in what Simulation Canada does, in that we offer programs to teach the teacher, to teach people those simulation facilitation and debriefing skills. We also, at the advocacy level, want to raise awareness of the value of that training and also make training available in emerging and new areas. For instance, a couple of years ago, we launched a program specifically about using and debriefing virtual simulations because that's been an area of recent explosion. We're now working with a couple experts to embed some content on the judicious use of AI in simulation programming and embedding that within our Keystone Simulation Certificate program. And then through other mechanisms like the annual Sim Expo, our annual conference, we want to highlight and make sure that researchers and innovators in Canada are able to disseminate their research findings, their innovations, their best practices to improve the skills of others across the country.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to participate in the embedding virtual simulation in practice, and it was a fantastic opportunity. It was virtual as well, so I was able to network with colleagues across Canada and really learn some of the great, build off of the experiences that others have been using at their institutes and programs. So I think those are fantastic opportunities to help educators with their continuing education in that area. So thank you for sharing some of those great
I'm glad you
opportunities.
participated, Lisa.
Yeah, it was great. I really enjoyed it. In your experience, what are some of the most critical components of effective simulation-based education? Maybe you can touch on a few items.
Oh, for sure. And there's again, a research base behind this too, and a couple of really good systematic reviews that look at what features of simulation-based education seem to most impact educational outcomes and the quality of it. And some of the things, not surprisingly, that come to the forefront are effective facilitation and debriefing, again, by a skilled and trained facilitator. But other important considerations are matching the types of realism emphasized in the simulation to the types of realism needed for the educational goals of the simulation. So we no longer really talk about a single concept of fidelity and whether a simulator is higher fidelity or lower fidelity, because there are things that a really sophisticated mannequin can replicate realistically, and there are things it can't. There are things that an actor can replicate realistically and things that they can't. There are things that virtual reality can replicate realistically and things that it can't. So every modality, as we call it, of simulation is going to have certain strengths and weaknesses that lend it more or less to certain educational goals. So matching those strengths of the modality to educational goals is important. And then we see other considerations like scaffolding. So starting with simpler, more straightforward simulations for novice learners to make sure that they're not overwhelmed by the amount of information coming at them and the behaviors that are expected of them. this ties into the concept of cognitive load theory, and but then progressing those simulations and building on them. So, a common example would be you don't need to immediately drop a student into an interprofessional high stakes resuscitation scenario. What you can do is break that into pieces and run simulations on some of these psychomotor components. If there's certain skill they have to do, like intubation, some of the interprofessional teamwork components, like crisis resource management. Teach those educational outcomes, help develop them in less complex simulations so that students are working up towards or scaffolding towards the ultimate goal of the really high realism integrated simulation at the end. So that kind of scaffolding is important. Um, Giving learners opportunities to repeat is very important, and that can be hard logistically with in-person simulations, but it's an area where virtual simulations really shines,
Mhm.
is giving students the opportunity to get their feedback and try again to see how their skills have evolved and to help consolidate um, and really cognitively encode the behaviors and the decisions that will lead to the best patient outcomes. And there are other considerations as well, but these are some of the ones that have come to the forefront.
I think those are great examples, especially when you talk about the scaffolding of learning and having students have that virtual experience. They can reattempt it. And then if they are going into that an in-person simulation, maybe, it will help build that psychological safety and encourage them to feel like they've seen it modeled positively and know how to recreate it in their own right, essentially. So thanks for sharing
Absolutely.
those. So I want to dive into what you see as some common challenges that organizations face when implementing simulation-based education, and how might they be addressed?
A very common problem, especially in the earlier days of simulation and amongst new adopters, is the focus on equipment over staff. And so often we have seen institutions invest in either bricks and mortars, a lab, or in expensive mannequins that then sit on shelves or in cases. And what you really need to make a simulation program come alive uh, are those staff and faculty who are excited by and passionate about simulation and are trained and have the skills to create effective simulation-based learning. And they can find ways to do it without the expensive equipment. But the expensive equipment won't create the simulation experiences on its own. So the investment um, in staff, along with or even prior to the investment in equipment, continues to be, I think, an important need for schools adopting simulation. Another challenge I see simulation programs have is articulating their value proposition. And again, as I alluded to earlier, there is a cost to running good simulations in a simulation program. Um, and the obvious value of a simulation program isn't always evident when you look at the budget line of an institution. So I think some sim labs struggle with articulating and demonstrating how they contribute to an institution in bigger terms. And here I'm thinking things like, how is the simulation program contributing to improved educational outcomes of students? How is the simulation program compensating for a lack of clinical placement sites such that student enrollment can be maintained or even increased in the face of decreasing clinical placement sites? In the case of a hospital-based program, how is the simulation program contributing to the quality improvement and patient safety outcomes of the organizations in a tangible way? that ultimately will reduce adverse events and indirect costs to the hospital or care agency. How is it contributing to staff morale and decreased turnover? Because that's a major problem facing healthcare institutions today is staff dissatisfaction and staff loss. So if we can where we can demonstrate positive benefits there, then it's quite easy to talk about or to demonstrate the value of a simulation program and see it as an investment in helping the institution achieve bigger, more important goals, some of which will increase, provide greater opportunities for revenue or decrease costs in other areas of operation.
And certainly, you think that like research studies and evaluation of simulation could help contribute to that piece as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, it could. But there's also plenty of published evidence as well. We can argue that there's never enough, and there's always unique circumstances. Um, but yes, so a rigorous evaluation program for the simulation center, combined with I think awareness of published evidence could help position sim centers to articulate that value.
And in your mind, with, quite a bit of rapid advancement we've seen in technology related to simulation, how do you see simulation practices evolving over the next 5 years, perhaps?
Yeah. So a couple trends that are undoubtedly coming. One is that virtual simulation was a very niche area, even within simulation. And by virtual simulation, I mean screen-based, flat screen-based, interactive simulations or virtual simulation games, they're sometimes called. It was very niche before the pandemic, absolutely essential during the pandemic. And what we've seen is not a return to baseline, but rather continued use of that modality. And I think simulation educators have seen its value, understand its niche, its strengths, its weaknesses compared to other simulation modalities. The other trend I see is extended reality. So virtual reality, augmented reality are just taking off right now. Again, until the past couple of years, it seemed to really depend on whether an institution had a faculty champion who was using it. And now I see institutions investing in virtual reality and augmented reality as part of their simulation programs. And I think that's partly driven by the cost of the technology becoming more accessible and in part by educators understanding, again, how virtual reality fits into the broader picture of different modalities and what it can offer, what its strengths are, what niches it can address that other forms of simulation perhaps can't, and even ways that it can be used to increase accessibility of simulations, especially for participants in rural locations where active participation in physical or in-person simulations is very difficult. So there's an accessibility consideration there too. And then the third trend, like all facets of life, it seems, is artificial intelligence, the accessibility of large language models, of image and video generation models are really, I think the use case that I see the most is folks using it to help supplement creation and expedite creation of simulation scenarios, to quickly produce images that they might need to enhance simulation. But also, I've seen the conversational AIs now are so the voices are so well articulated and the response is so close to real time that I've even seen people putting iPhones with ChatGPT running beside a mannequin and using that as a way to give a patient to converse with while using the mannequin as the physical simulator. So
Interesting. I
There's
haven't thought
going to
of
be
it of
big
that.
going to be big changes, I think, again, in the fidelity um, and the accessibility and hopefully the cost of simulators with these technologies.
That's so interesting about the use of AI in combination with a mannequin for in-person simulation. My natural thought process was virtual and communication-based scenarios around that, but I had not thought of that. So thank you for sharing that. Very interesting. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. It's been very insightful hearing about the upcoming advances in simulation and those best practices and promoting, for those maybe just starting out or just getting into the world of simulation. I think you've provided a lot of great insight. So thank you so much for your time today.
My pleasure, Lisa. Thanks for having me.
This series is proudly produced by the team at Road 55. Road 55 creates content that connects. For more information, visit our website at road55.ca.